So I think this is on. Is it on? Okay. Well, welcome to the, I guess it's a youth presentation, but I don't think we have an age limit, but maybe 94. If you're over 94, maybe it's not. The topic is Luther and the Reformation, or Luther and his teachings. And this happens that our Bible class king in Elk River, Marcus Lohe, put the schedule together. I think I got it last December or something for the schedule, Bible class schedule for this year. And he had, I think, 5 lessons in there throughout the year on Martin Luther. And I'm not sure why I got the first one, but it was Luther and his life, or something like that. And maybe they thought that because of my age, I could remember personal conversations with Luther. But that's not the case. So I did kind of dig into it, and I very much enjoyed it. But, I thought that we had a whole Bible class lesson for just this one narrow little topic of Luther and his teachings. And so I thought we ought to broaden it a little bit. And so I start off with Dan's History of the Universe. And actually, there is a motivation for using this, is just to put a context of where does Luther fit in history. So if we start here at creation, and this is based on the Bible, go to the flood and the patriarchs. Oh, we need a different artist. And Moses going through the wilderness, and they finally got to Canaan, and they settled in, and then the kingdom of Jerusalem, David, and Solomon. Solomon builds a temple, and then the kingdom divides, and the Babylonian captivity. There's the 70 years there of the captivity and the restoration of the temple, and then the end of the Old Testament, and the birth of Jesus, his life and death, and then the early church, and on to Roman Catholic domination. So now we're 1,500 years or so later that we come to Martin Luther. And so, and let's take a look at, if I can figure out how to operate this machine here. At particularly this part of from after Jesus, there's the early church, and Emperor Constantine was a Roman emperor, and he converted to Christianity and made Christianity the official religion in the Roman Empire. So the Christians were no longer being persecuted, at least not fed to the lions anymore, and then during this period of maybe from year 1000 or so, you get this domination of the Roman Church and the papacy, or the papal control. And then Martin Luther comes in. Well, Luther, he did not want to start a new religion. He did not start a new religion. He wanted to take the Roman Church that had gone so far into the traditions of men and return it back to the apostolic roots of the Bible. And that was what he wanted to do. And he wanted to reform the church. Let's look at Mark 15, or Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, and just to get an example that kind of relates to what Luther faced. Then came together unto him the Pharisees, and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of the disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, unwashen hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be, which they have received to hold as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and of tables. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why walk not thy disciples according to the traditions of the elders, but eat bread with unwashen hands? And he answered unto them, Well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of men, ye hold the traditions of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men, as washing of pots and cups, and many other such like things ye do. And he said unto them, Full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition. So this was Jesus talking with the scribes and Pharisees of his day. And then 1,500 years later, Martin Luther comes along, and he we could say wars against the papacy, and the parallel is striking. That is, the church fathers relying on the doctrines of men and not on the Bible. One important difference, though, that we need to make sure that we keep in mind. In the first example, we were talking about Jesus, who was, as we teach and preach and understand, the Son of God and a divine being. Luther was a man, like you and like me. And I've often said this about myself, that I have feet of clay, and so I leave dirty footprints on the carpet where I walk. And we could say the same thing about Luther, that he was not a divine being, and he was a good teacher, and we can learn from Luther, but we don't want to fall into trying to what we could say deify Luther, to put him up on a level with God. Okay, Reformation. Now, if we talked about just the Reformation, sort of a real big picture thing, the things you hear about is Luther posts these 95 theses attacking indulgences. And then the emperor tries Luther at the diet of worms. Now, that's not a robin's breakfast. It's I suppose it would be pronounced diet of worms, but I'm not German, so it's the diet of worms, and it declares him an outlaw. Well, if you look at the Reformation that way, it's kind of equivalent to telling the story of World War II in the Pacific in this way. Japan attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. retaliated by dropping the atom bomb on Japan. And while those things are true, there's 3.5 years and thousands of men dying in between those two events. And those events, the activities between those events, both in the example in World War II, as well as in Luther's life, are critical to understanding the situation. So let's look at Luther and a little bit, and we'll concentrate on that time period. We'll focus mainly on this time between where the 95 theses are posted and when he's tried. So he was born in 1483. Now, there was something else happened in 1492. It slips my mind now, but something about Columbus or something. So we're back about that time, about the time that Columbus is sailing in to the thinking he found India and missed it by a few thousand miles. But anyway, that was 1492. And now this is 1483 that Luther is born. And he dies in 1546. Hans Luther, his father, wanted Martin to be a lawyer. And in that day, as in our day, lawyers made good money. And so he wanted his son to support him in his old age. I don't know if my boys are still here, but that would be a good idea. And so he wanted Martin to become a lawyer because lawyers made the big bucks. But instead, Martin became a monk. And there's a legend, a story, maybe factually true, about how that came about, that Luther was studying at Erfurt. He was on his way back to the school after being at home. He had to walk. A violent thunderstorm occurs, and a lightning bolt strikes close enough. It knocks Luther to the ground, and he vowed on St. Anne, he vowed that if he survived that storm, that he would devote his life to the church and become a monk. And he not only became a monk, but he joined the Augustinian order, which is among the most strict. And he took a vow of poverty and lived a life of self-denial. In fact, his life of denial, self-denial, was so extreme that he fasted to such extreme that he had health problems all his life that were perhaps attributed to his severe life that he lived in the monastery. I think there was one more thing I wanted to say about this. Obviously, taking a vow of poverty, his father was disappointed. He didn't think that he would get the sort of old age retirement situation from having a son as a monk that he would have had he been a lawyer. And it bothered the relationship to the point they were eventually reconciled, but for a time his father Hans, I don't know if he said disowned him, but it was a very strained relationship. And there's this man, Dr. Staupitz, and Dr. Staupitz is the vicar general. He's the head honcho of this Augustinian order in that area. And he likes Luther. And Luther, like I said, he was so dedicated and so committed. Luther believed that the way to salvation was he could earn his salvation as a monk, and he was so committed and so rigorous in his life that it has been said that if it would have been possible to earn salvation that way, surely Luther would have done it. Dr. Staupitz was a long-term influence on Luther's life. And among the most important things that he did was he imparted to Luther this idea to study the Bible. That was more important than studying the sentences and the other laws, the canonical laws of the church. Study the Bible. And Luther took that to heart and studied the Bible. And there's one part, it's not known exactly when Luther had the grace of repentance. History hasn't recorded that particular event. But there's one event in his life, as recorded in one of these biographies, called The Triumph of Truth. I'd just like to read this short excerpt from that book. One day, as he lay overwhelmed with despair, an aged monk entered his cell. I'm going to step back. Staupitz was also kind of a father confessor to Luther, and they had a good relationship that way. And Staupitz often offered comfort to Luther. He really liked Martin Luther, and he offered a lot of comfort to him to stay the course, to live that life, and was able to comfort him with his knowledge and his background in the church laws and so on. One day, as he lay overwhelmed with despair, an aged monk entered his cell and addressed a few words of comfort to him. Luther opened his heart to him and made known the fears by which he was tormented. The venerable old man was incapable of following up that soul in all its doubts as Staupitz had done. But he knew his creed and had found in it much consolation to his heart. He therefore applied the same remedy to his young brother, leading him back to the Apostles' Creed, which Luther had learned in early childhood at the school of Mansfeld. The aged monk repeated this article with kind good nature. I believe in the forgiveness of sins. These simple words, which the pious brother pronounced with sincerity in this decisive moment, diffused great consolation in Luther's heart. I believe, he replied. He repeated to himself ere long on his bed of sickness, I believe in the forgiveness of sins. Ah, said the monk, you must believe not only in the forgiveness of David's and of Peter's sins, for even the devils believe. For this even the devils believe. It is God's command that we believe our own sins forgiven us. The testimony of the Holy Ghost in thy heart is this, thy sins are forgiven thee. Well, we don't know, like I said, exactly when Luther had the grace of repentance, but it may well, as you read the biography, you can see this sounds very much like one coming and finding God's kingdom and receiving the gospel of forgiveness of sins and believing it. Well, in 1502 or something, I don't remember the years exactly, but Frederick the Wise, who's the prince in this area of Saxony, and kind of the big honcho politically, he wants to have a university. So he funds and founds a university at Wittenberg. And Dr. Staupitz is named as the head of the theology department. And Staupitz taps Luther to come teach and be a lecturer of the Bible, and also encouraged him to continue his studies and become a doctor of divinity, which Luther does. And he serves the castle church there at Wittenberg as a priest. 95 Theses. October 31, 1517, Luther's 34 years old. And this has been pointed to as the start of the Reformation, and I suppose it's a good starting point. But it's not really the beginning of the turmoil, I suppose you could say, in the Roman Church. Long before that, a man named John Wycliffe in England wrote sermons, wrote devotional articles, where he called into question the teachings of the Pope and the papacy, and many things that were doctrinal that Wycliffe challenged. And as a result, Wycliffe was a university professor. He was taken out of that position, not allowed to teach anymore because of the pressure from the church. But he went on and continued to write. And in fact, he was one of he worked on translating the Bible into English, the New Testament in particular. And as we look at our King James Bible today, the New Testament is probably about 90+% Wycliffe, that it's just been carried forward because his translation was so good. Then there's another man named John Huss, or Jan Hus, if you get into the ethnic pronunciation, who died 100 years before, in 1415. And Huss died, he was burned at the stake for his teaching of Wycliffe's doctrine, using Wycliffe's writings for his teaching. And so he was called a heretic, excommunicated, and in fact was burned at the stake. And that event also is very significant because Huss had been given no, I'm sorry, senior moment. Safe passage. He was given safe passage and guaranteed that he could come because he wasn't going to come. There was a conference, a council at right there, and he wasn't going to come because Constance, and he said it's not safe for him to go there. So he wasn't going to come, but he was guaranteed safe passage by the local king, and so he went. And once he was there, the Roman church officials convinced the king that he didn't have to honor a safe passage to a heretic, and they had decided that Huss was a heretic. So at that time, then, when he showed up, they put him in prison and held him there until they decided it was time to burn him at the stake, which they did. Well, this triggers Huss lived in Bohemia, had quite a following there, and it triggered 30 years of, and I think 3 or 4 different crusades from Rome against the Bohemians, and they resisted them all. And so the Bohemians stayed as in opposition to the Roman Church. So Luther's 95 Theses being posted in 1517 is a very significant event, and we'll get into that in detail. But it is to say it's a starter of the Reformation is a little bit like it ignores that there was a lot of rumbling going on, and there was a lot of distrust and a lot of we could say anti-clerical sentiment, especially in Germany, that we'll get into in a little bit here. Okay, Luther wanted to reform the church, not start a schism. So why did Luther's Reformation stick and Huss and Wycliffe hadn't? Well, I suppose you could debate that a long time, but the final analysis, you'd have to almost say that it was God's time. It wasn't before that, and it wasn't after that. That was the time that God saw the need to cleanse the church. Okay, let's look at some overlapping and conflicting agendas of the time, and I think it'll help us understand what Luther was dealing with. Money and power from Rome. Pope Leo, Archbishop Albert, Johann Tetzel are names that we'll discuss in some detail. They want to maintain the status quo. They've got a good deal going. There's a lot of money flowing from Germany into Rome, and they're benefiting from that. And so they want to just keep things as they are. Religious doctrine based on traditions of the fathers and not on the Bible. Well, it isn't necessarily these 3 characters, but they are all church officials. One's a pope, one's an archbishop. Johann Tetzel is a Franciscan friar. So, but the doctrine that they teach and preach is largely based on the traditions of the fathers of the Roman Church, and not on the Bible. Luther, on the other hand, Luther wants to make it to heaven. That's his interest. He's concerned about the salvation of his soul, and he has been in the monastery. He's a priest, and it hasn't been satisfying to him. It hasn't given him peace. He hasn't thought that, I'm on the right track. I'm on the way to heaven. And it troubles him greatly. So he looks not to the canonical laws, but he looks to the Bible. And he comes across and studies this one verse in Romans at great length. The just shall live by faith. And he takes this doctrine, and this becomes sort of the doctrine of the Reformation. He wants to correct the spiritual errors of the Roman Church, And he has a lot of support from the princes who had grievances with Rome, especially over money. So it isn't just the religious or the spiritual troubles, but it's also financial. Let's talk about the money aspect of it. As I said, Luther, he's taken a vow of poverty. He is not concerned about money. I think from the way I read his biography, if he could have gotten along without money, it would have been fine. And after he got married, his wife, fortunately, was a good manager, and so she managed the finances because he probably wouldn't have paid any attention to it. So money was not a motivating factor in his life. Pope Leo X he's a Medici in the family in Italy. A very wealthy family, and he spends lavishly. He not only lives in high style. I suppose I tried to think of, well, I've read the numbers, but they're in currency that florins and things that I don't have any idea what their equivalent values would be. But I kind of think about, lifestyles like the top line entertainers or professional athletes live these fantastic lifestyles, got these huge homes and so on. That's sort of the level that Pope Leo lived at in Rome. And besides that, he's come from a lot of wealth. He's got a lot of money coming in, but he spends more than he's taking in. So he's driving down the papal treasury, and he's got kind of a problem that way. He likes to reward his friends with all kinds of lavish gifts, and so he keeps spending money more than he's taking in. Okay, Archbishop Albert of Mainz, that's actually Luther's archbishop, and he already has two titles and two offices in the Roman Church, which, according to the canonical laws, they're only allowed to have one, but he's already got two, and he wants a third. So he wants to be archbishop. And Leo needs the money, so he's willing to sell the title. And that was literally what they did. They sold the positions. And I don't know what an archbishop position in Mainz sells for, but I suppose maybe something like a Senate seat in Illinois or something like that. So it's a big money deal. And Albert comes from a rich family, and he wants this thing, so he wants more power. And he can't afford to. He doesn't have the cash in the front pocket, so he has to borrow money from the Fruger family, and they're a very wealthy family. They made their gazillions in finance, and so he goes into debt to buy this archbishop position. Well, he's got to pay that. He needs some cash coming in. So he devises a scheme and works out a deal with Albert and Leo work out a deal that Pope Leo will issue the right to sell indulgences in Germany. And they get this man, Johann Tetzel. And Tetzel's a super salesman. I don't know who I could equate him to or in our time, but he's a super salesman, and maybe a P.T. Barnum if you studied any history about Barnum. But he's selling these indulgences. And what's an indulgence? An indulgence is a piece of paper, but it's a piece of paper that when you own it, you are freed from any punishment for the sin that you committed when you bought that. So you buy, I've kind of likened it, and this is a little flip way of looking at it, if you play Monopoly, a get out of jail free card. That you commit a sin, but there's no consequence going to come from that because you have this indulgence certificate. And Tetzel would come into a town, and he'd have a road show. He'd have tents and a big cross painted bright red and set this up. And the band from the city would come out and meet him at the city limits, and they would march in and they'd set up, I don't know if it's something like this, but set up a tent and hold services and sell indulgences. And he was very good at it. And so there was a lot of money coming in. And Leo and Archbishop Albert had decided that their deal was that whatever Tetzel generates, half for you, half for me. And so that's the way it was divided. So half to go to Rome and half goes to Archbishop Albert, who needs the cash flow to pay his debt. Okay, now Frederick the Wise, Luther's bishop or prince rather, he said, Tetzel, you can't come into my territory. He had outlawed him. He wouldn't let him come in. But Wittenberg was quite close to the county line, I suppose, and so Tetzel would be just on the other side of the line. And so parishioners from Luther's church, from Luther's congregation, would go over and frequent Tetzel's indulgence sales. Well, Luther's a priest, and he's a devout man, and a sincere man. And his parishioners would come to confession, and he would preach absolution, and then tell them whatever the satisfaction that was required according to the Catholic Church. And then maybe it was as simple as like Jesus' command to the woman, the sinful woman who he told, go and sin no more. Well, when these people had this indulgence, they said, I don't have to worry about that. And they pull out this piece of paper. Now, you've got a sincerely believing man in Luther being told this by his parishioners, by his congregation. And it just so I suppose upsetting. I can't imagine what that would have been like for a man in Luther's position to be told that I don't have to worry about that because I got this piece of paper. And it's that sort of the indulgences. That's what drove Luther to post those 95 theses. And most of those 95... So what are 95 theses? Anybody who's read the 95 theses? I don't think I made it through all 95, but anyway, what that is, it's a list of points, and these were points that were a thesis, a statement. This is what I think, and he had a list of 95 of them, most of them pertaining to indulgences, and he posted that on the church door. That's the legend. Now I read in some other modern history, more modern research, they're questioning with it, but I like it on the church door, so we're going to leave it there. So he nailed it up on the church door, and that was sort of the bulletin board. They're written in Latin, and it was it's who wants to. We want to debate these issues, and there's 95 of them. And he posted up on a bulletin board, which was the church door. It was a bulletin board at that time, and people would then get together. I suppose they'd schedule some sort of a meeting to debate those, and have a disputation and talk about those indulgences, or talk about these theses rather. And most of those 95 theses deal with Luther's. I don't know if abhorrence is too strong a word, but his distaste for and his hatred of the indulgence practices. I said they were written in Latin. That was the language of the church. Within days, they were translated into German. And the printing press had been developed within the previous century, and Gutenberg movable type and all that good stuff. Well, it was before the internet, but those theses were translated into German, were printed, and distributed within a few weeks all over that part of Germany, and widely read, and received well. Again, like for the reasons we talked about earlier, that some for spiritual distaste for the Roman Church and the doctrine, but many also because of the anti-clerical feeling that existed that was so widespread because of the corruption of the church and the greed of the clergy, and people just didn't like it. And there was also, with this building project, I didn't mention it, Leo was also building the St. Peter's Basilica. So he needs all kinds of money for that. Mileposts of the battle. So this is the opening salvo for Martin Luther. October 31st, 1517, he posts these 95 theses on the church door in Wittenberg, the Castle Church, and they cause an uproar, and it's widespread, and it starts to boil. Needless to say, it does a job on the cash flow coming from the indulgence sales. I don't know that it stopped it, but it sure put a crimp in the hose, and so it caught the attention of the Roman Church, of the papacy in Rome, and they read some of Luther's arguments in his 95 Theses. They read them all and studied them and concluded, I don't remember how many they concluded were wrong. And so they summoned Luther, the Pope summoned Luther to come to Rome to face potential charges of heresy. And it's not advised to go to Rome, to go turn yourself into the papal powers, with the memory of John Huss so fresh in their minds, that he was advised, and his prince, Frederick the Wise, negotiated a deal with the Pope that, well, we won't send Luther to Rome, but if you send one of your reigning officials up here to Germany, Luther can meet with Luther here. And so that's what was arranged. And there's Cardinal, I call him Cajetan, but I'm sure that's not right. I think it's Cajetan or something like that, that meets Luther. Now, this is already a year later in Augsburg. Now, this isn't why the Cardinal came, but he came for a bigger meeting, but he's going to deal with this Luther situation. Now, the typical way that the papacy had dealt with dissenters in the church was with force, and witness John Huss. And that was typical practice. I don't know if you ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition, but this is the same time. This was the practices of the church. You want somebody to confess to heresy? A little torture helps, and then you get them to say what you want them to say. And then you've got reason to either excommunicate or worse, or put them to death. So Luther agrees to meet with Cardinal Cajetan. He is hopeful, Luther's hopeful, that he will be able to argue his points and have a reasonable debate with a well-learned churchman. Cajetan tells him he's only interested in one thing. I think the Latin word is revoca, but recant. And that's all he wants. He doesn't want to discuss anything. He wants Luther to just say that, okay, I retract what I've written. And of course, if he does retract anything, then that's on his record, so to speak. So anything he would say in the future, they could just say, well, this is a guy that talks out of both sides of his mouth and so on. So his credibility would be lost. So he can't in good conscience. So he doesn't, he gets into heated arguments with Cajetan. And Cajetan's approach isn't he didn't come on as a drill sergeant or a demanding, rather he came on, his approach, he even though he came with orders to bring Luther back to Rome, and it was clear that was his mission, he said the better approach than to just brute force it, he says, is to treat this wayward brother like and Cajetan is an elder cardinal, high-ranking church official, and he sort of puts his arm around Martin and says, Martin, just sort of retract what you said and let's just get on with life. Let's just put this incident behind us. Well, Luther won't do it. To him, it's a matter of conscience, and he can't accept that. So the meeting with Cajetan ends in a stalemate. In fact, Luther sneaks out of town. He finds out that Cajetan's got orders and authority to take him physically back to Rome, and so he beats it out of town at night, and so before Cajetan's aware that he's gone. But they met for several days, so it isn't like 10 minutes. Okay, January 1519, Emperor Maximilian dies. We're going to come back to that, but I just put it in here because it's where it fits in the chronology, and it gives Luther a little breathing room. It's a reason why, it's one of the contributing factors why Luther wasn't subjected to extreme pressure during that time frame. Also during 1519, Luther disputes with Dr. Eck, and Dr. Eck is a very well-educated, highly skilled debater, and the way that the things were decided in the norm for the day was that you'd have two disputants who would get together and lay out their lines of reasoning on a particular point, and they would argue. And they'd have this debate, and the debate would be scored, scored, judged, and by some highly regarded officials, university officials, and so on, university professors, and so on. So he has this debate with Eck, and after this is finally judged and the verdicts come back, Eck is declared the winner. But by that time, it doesn't matter. It's too late. It takes a long time for those decisions to be rendered. But in that debate, Eck kind of maneuvers the thing to get Luther to be in a position where he is defending John Huss. And of course, to defend a heretic, one who has been declared a heretic, is to become a heretic. And so he had kind of maneuvered Luther into that position. And it was a council, and it was the Pope that had declared Huss a heretic. So Luther is saying, councils can err, and the Pope can err. The only real authority is the Bible. And so this is where this Luther really is forced into sort of publicly taking that position of the Bible as life's highest authority. Okay, 1520, in June, there's a papal bull. The Pope is finally frustrated with all of this stuff, and he issues a bull, which is just an order, saying, you got 60 days to retract what you said, and if you don't, you'll be kept as a heretic and dealt with accordingly. In November of 1520, Luther issues his reaction to the papal bull, and this is a little bit longer, but I want to read it. What Luther does is he gets five trusted people, noblemen, to come and be witnesses, and he gets a notary public, and he puts together this statement, and this is his response to the papal bull of excommunication. Well, he wasn't. Well, okay. Considering that a general council of the Christian church is above the Pope, especially in matters of faith, considering that the power of the Pope is not above but inferior to Scripture, and that he has no right to slaughter the sheep of Christ's flock and throw them into the jaws of the wolf. I, Martin Luther, an Augustinian friar, doctor of the Holy Scriptures at Wittenberg, appeal by these presents in behalf of myself and of those who are or shall be with me, from the most holy Pope Leo to a future general and Christian council. I appeal from the said Pope, first as an unjust, rash, and tyrannical judge who condemns me without hearing and without giving any reasons for his judgment. Secondly, as a heretic and as an apostate, misled, hardened, and condemned by the Holy Scriptures, who commands me to deny that an antichrist, an adversary, an oppressor of the Holy Scriptures, who dares set his own words in opposition to the Word of God. Fourthly, as a despiser, a calumniator, a blasphemer of the Holy Christian Church and a free council, who maintains that a council is nothing of itself. For this reason, with all humility, I entreat the most serene, most illustrious, excellent, generous, noble, strong, wise, and prudent lords, namely Charles, Emperor of Rome, and electors, princes, counts, barons, knights, gentlemen, counselors, cities, and communities of the whole Christian nation, to adhere to my protest and to resist with me the anti-Christian conduct of the Pope for the glory of God, the defense of the Church, and of Christian doctrine, and for the maintenance of free councils of Christendom, and Christ our Lord will reward them bountifully by his everlasting grace. But if there be any who scorn my prayer and continue to obey that impious man, the Pope, rather than God, I reject by these presents all responsibility, having faithfully warned their consciences, and I abandon them to the supreme judgment of God with the Pope and his adherents. Well, I suppose you could say that Luther was not politically correct. He didn't worry about political correctness. He was rather blunt-spoken, and even in his day, and I don't know how to judge that the norms of speech and decorum, courteous discourse in that day, but he, even by the standards of that day, was regarded as too blunt, too direct. But that's his response to the papal bull. Okay, in 1520 then, Luther publishes two documents. One of them, the Appeal to the German Nobility, where he espouses espousing the priesthood of believers. And I want to just talk about that priesthood of believers for just a moment. You know, we believers know and understand that concept of the priesthood of the believers. Even the littlest ones who come to services. You see, how many times have we seen one of our speakers up here at these services come to a point where they feel their own poorness and ask the congregation that, can I hear the gospel? And who raises their hand to bless everyone in the audience? Why? Because they're all priests. They all are authorized by the Bible. Like Apostle Peter writes, a royal priesthood. And so Luther, that was not the case in Luther's Germany. There, the only absolution could be preached by a priest, by a clergy, and not by the guy next to you in the bench. And Luther said, no, that's wrong. And this is where in this one tract that he writes, Appeal to the German Nobility, he makes that point especially clear. He also publishes The Babylonian Captivity of the Christian Church, attacking most of the sacraments and the Mass as a sacrifice. So now he's taking on not only the people, not only the Pope and the cardinals for their corruption, but he's saying the very doctrines of the Church are flawed. They're wrong. And so this is where, in this Babylonian captivity, he makes it so clear that the sacramental, the theology of sacramental theology as lived by the Church with the seven sacraments, Luther says that's not right. In December of 1520, Luther burns the papal bull. They have a big book burning. When that bull was issued against Luther, the Pope also said to burn all of Luther's books, and many communities, I suppose, did that. They'd build a big bonfire and throw Luther's books in there, and that was their way to deal with that. And so Luther, on December 10th of 1520, builds a big scaffold, and they put all of the canonical laws and the Roman decretals, the papal decretals in there, light them on fire, and the last thing then Luther walks up and he throws that papal bull into the fire, burns it. I want to talk a little bit about the politics of the time, and only because it does affect what Luther does and how he gets along. Death of Maximilian, the emperor, and the election of Charles V. Maximilian dies in January of 1519, and that leaves a void. Well, now the Holy Roman Empire, well, it's basically Germany, the area now that we call Germany, but at the time it was a bunch of little principalities, and they elected an emperor over that whole deal, and they call it the Holy Roman Empire. And when the emperor died, then there's nobody they need to hold an election to replace him. And the politics of the time gets a little, I won't get into it, but the Pope doesn't want Charles to be emperor. And so in that political maneuvering of the time, it buys time, and the Pope is preoccupied with things other than Luther. So Luther's free to write these tracts and publish them, as we've seen. Okay, finally, in June of 1519, Charles is elected, and he's the grandson of Maximilian. He is a Spaniard by his parents are Spanish. He was actually born in the Netherlands, but he is not German. But now he is the ruler of Germany, of the Holy Roman Empire. So, and he's got all these princes that he needs to deal with. So he needs to get together, and he doesn't speak German, but he needs to get together with his princes to make sure that they're willing to support him with tax money and with soldiers. So it's important that they get together. So this Diet at Worms, what that is, it's a convening of the princes and the emperor. The emperor calls all the princes, okay, come to this meeting. And it actually starts in January of 1521. Luther's not on the agenda. What is on the agenda is getting the taxes straightened around and making sure that the princes will support the emperor's, the wars that's going on, and the Turks are coming up from the east, and so they're worried about these things. It's a political convention. So he called it. He's a new guy. Charles V, he's 20 years old, and he needs to meet these German princes. Luther is finally called in April as an afterthought. And there's a man, Aleander, who is a nuncio of the Pope. He's an ambassador, and he's been lobbying the emperor at Worms, that let's get this Luther thing on the agenda. Let's take care of this guy. You're the emperor now, you can do it. And Charles isn't anxious to do that. It's a religious matter. He'd just as soon let the church deal with it. And the church is telling them, no, we need the political power to be involved in it. So eventually, Aleander, this is what he had to say when he came to Germany. He says, at present, all of Germany is in a decided uproar. 9/10 put up the battle cry, Luther, and the other 10th say, death to the Roman Curia. So there's a lot of discord, a lot of frustration with Rome. And then he keeps a speech. The emperor finally allows him. He says, okay, tell you what, Aleander, you come. I'll let you address the Diet, and if you can convince them to put Luther on the agenda, then we'll do it. So he keeps this speech to the princes at the Diet. He said, no, the difference between Luther and the Pope does not turn on the papal interests. I have Luther's books before me, and a man only need to have eyes in his head to see that he attacks the holy doctrines of the Church. He teaches that those alone communicate worthily whose consciences are overwhelmed with sorrow and confusion because of their sins, that no one is justified by baptism if he has not faith in the promise of which baptism is a pledge. He denies the necessity of works to obtain heavenly glory. He denies that we have liberty and power of obeying the natural and divine law. He asserts that we win of necessity in every one of our actions. Has the arsenal of hell ever sent forth weapons better calculated to break the bonds of decency? He preaches in favor of abolition of monastic vows. Can we imagine any greater sacrilegious impiety? Shall I enumerate all the crimes of this Augustinian monk? He sins against the dead, for he denies purgatory. He sins against heaven, for he says that he would not believe even an angel from heaven. He sins against the church, for he maintains that all Christians are priests. He sins against the saints, for he despises their venerable writings. He sins against councils, for he designates the Council of Constance an assembly of devils. He sins against the world, for he forbids the punishment of death to be inflicted on any man who has not committed a deadly sin. Some of you may say that he is a pious man. I have no desire to attack his life, but only to remind this assembly that the devil often deceives people in the garb of truth. Well, I don't know if you could find a clearer listing of Luther's teachings than that laid out by his opponent. But anyway, Luther does get the call. He comes to Worms. Luther's hoping that he finally gets a chance to plead his case, to tell about his doctrine, to get some discussion about it. And he's only told that when he finally shows up there, and on his way to Worms from Wittenberg, he's met along the way by crowds, and they like cheer him on. He's such a popular person in Germany at that time. And when he finally gets to Worms, they can't get down the street to the cathedral where the meeting is on the main street. They have to go in the back alleys to get him in. So he finally gets in there, and they stack up all his books. They got all his books piled up on a table. And they ask him, did you write these books? And do you retract what's written in there? Or anything that's written in there? And Luther says that it's too big a question he can't answer. He says, I'll tell you, I wrote those books, but I can't answer the bigger question. I need more time. And so he's granted another day. He said, okay, come back here 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And he's asked the same questions. There's no discussion. He gets no chance to defend himself. Do you retract or not? And he says, unless shown to be in error by the word of God, I cannot and will not retract. So he's condemned by the emperor as an outlaw, given 21 days safe conduct. So he's got to get back. 21 days to go back home. And then, as an outlaw, that means that anyone can turn him in and can arrest him and turn him in, or anyone could take his life without punishment. So he's a hunted man. Frederick the Wise is his prince. Frederick likes Luther. He's not converted to Luther's theology at this point, but he likes Luther, and he's basically a fair man. And he says Luther's never had a fair trial. He's never had a chance to present his defense. He's been condemned without a trial, and so Frederick arranges this strange event to happen on the way back home, and that's Luther gets kidnapped. And so they're riding in a little cart. And some guys come ride out of the woods with hoods on and masks, and they physically drag Luther out of the cart and put him on a horse, and they kind of treat him roughly. and but he's kidnapped and he's hauled off, and they ride around for the rest of the day to obscure their trail, and finally wind up at the Wartburg Castle, where he is taken. And Frederick the Wise has engineered this whole thing, but he doesn't know. Frederick doesn't know where Luther's taken, so he can tell people, "No, I don't know where he is." He has deniability, I guess. So he's taken to the Wartburg Castle. Let's sing the song that has become got to be the anthem of the Reformation. And when we sing these words, very familiar words, a mighty fortress, but think about Luther's situation. How he is on his way. He actually wrote this, I understand, on his way to Worms. And he's going there thinking that he's going on his last journey in life. And he writes the words to this song. So let's sing it now. So here he is on his way to Worms, knowing that this may well be the last days of his life. And he writes this song, and he take they then what they will, our life, our goods, and still. E'en when their worst is done, they yet have nothing won. The kingdom ours remaineth. So this becomes Luther. The Wartburg Castle becomes Luther's home away from home. And he becomes Knight George. That's his disguise. They tell me, grow out his beard, let your hair grow long, and get rid of your priest's garb, and put on this the clothes of the knight. And he becomes then Knight George, and he stayed 10 months at Wartburg Castle as a guest of Frederick the Wise. He translated the New Testament into German in that time. It was published in 1522. He said he was making the Bible speak German. He returned to Wittenberg in 1522, and there would be much more we could say about that, but in the interest of time, I won't get into that. But the question is, why did Luther survive? For centuries, Rome had not pronounced a sentence of condemnation that her arm had not followed up with death. For centuries. Was it the protection of Frederick? Well, certainly Frederick played a key part in protecting Luther. Did the emperor and the princes fear all of the followers of the popular Luther? If they would have put him to death, would there have been blood rolling in the streets from popular uprisings? You know, historians have to apparently come to a conclusion on those matters. We can say, in all confidence, that however it was made manifest, it was the protection of God. God protected Luther because it was his time to work and his time to bring the Reformation to the church. And God needed 24 more years of work out of Luther. He wrote the small and large catechisms, an uncountable number of tracts and sermons. He wound up translating the entire Bible into German. We've got 20 or more songs in our hymnal that are attributed to Luther, either as the author or, in some cases, a contributor to certain songs. And like Song 168 is the Lord's Prayer. Song 180, the Ten Commandments. Song 209 is the Creed. There was very little literacy in Luther's day. And yet it was so important. He felt it was so important that to teach especially to the young people, but to everybody, the essence of the gospel. And so he wrote songs. And all you young people, you sing all the time. And you memorize songs, right? You probably know half the songbook. And so by putting these lessons into songs, then we're also teaching the ABCs of Christianity, living faith. Okay, Martin Luther. What can we say about Martin Luther? To know his life, read his biographies. There are many, many, many Luther biographies. To know what he wrote, read his writings. There's libraries full of Luther writings. To know what he taught, look around this room. We live. One of the things in my study of Luther that's been so striking to me is how, when I read what he wrote and I see how we preach. You want to know what Luther taught? Come to our services. Come to hear what we preach. We preach the same gospel that Luther taught. And I find that very comforting to me. And maybe surprising, I don't know why I should be surprised at it. I was visiting with one brother about it. He said, why would you be surprised? We both use the same Bible. And that's true. That was what was important to Luther, was the Bible. And we preach from that same Bible. So let's all join this evening and close this evening by joining together and saying the benediction. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. And thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for your attention.